War does strange things to men. It reveals their deepest fears, their sharpest ambitions, and the quiet truths they hide, even from themselves. And in the long, complicated shadow of World War II, two American generals, George S. Patton and Dwight D. Eisenhower, stood at the center of a relationship that was equal parts respect, rivalry, admiration, and bruised pride. Their journey together began long before the war. But the moment Eisenhower became Patton's boss changed everything. What Patton said, publicly, privately, emotionally, was shaped by decades of friendship, ambition, and the raw hunger to lead. It is not a single sentence, but an entire story. Years before Eisenhower would command millions of Allied troops, he was just a quiet, thoughtful officer with a brilliant mind for logistics. Patton, meanwhile, was the thunder in the room, the man whose boots seemed to strike the ground with more meaning than anyone else's. He spoke loudly, dreamed boldly, and lived as though destiny owed him its spotlight. Yet despite their differences, Patton saw something special in the younger officer. Eisenhower's calm, strategic thinking fascinated him, and Patton became one of the first men to recognize Eisenhower's potential. It was during their early years that the seeds of their complicated bond were planted. Patton would drill cavalry tactics with a passion that bordered on obsession, while Eisenhower studied movements, patterns, the flow of men and machines. Patton fought with fire. Eisenhower fought with reason. They respected each other deeply, but they were not equals, not yet. Patton was the senior. Patton was the warrior. Patton was the one everyone assumed would rise fastest. But destiny does not always choose the loudest man in the room. As World War II ignited across Europe, the United States suddenly needed leaders who could navigate not just the battlefield, but global politics and complicated alliances. Eisenhower, calm, diplomatic, steady, quickly rose through the ranks. Washington trusted him. Britain trusted him. Even the doubting French trusted him. Unlike Patton, Eisenhower never frightened politicians, never confused allies, never caused newspapers to explode in scandal. He was the perfect man for a world at war. Then came the moment that shook Patton's heart like an earthquake. In early 1942, the U.S. Army announced the appointment of a supreme commander for the coming operations in Europe. It was the most powerful military position any American had ever held, one that would define the war and history itself. Patton, having spent his whole life preparing to lead armies in battle, believed that his destiny was finally arriving. His confidence was not arrogance. He truly believed he was the man for the job, the one born to face Hitler's war machine head-on. But the order came down. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Not Patton. Not the legendary cavalry officer. Not the fiery genius the newspapers already whispered about. But Ike, the quiet, thoughtful officer whom Patton once mentored. In that instant, Patton's world shifted. Men close to him would later say they saw something in his eyes that day, something he tried to hide behind discipline. Shock, hurt, a sense of betrayal by fate, if not by friend. He was a warrior built for command, yet command had chosen someone else. Patton walked out of the briefing room without speaking. He didn't explode. He didn't argue. He simply walked. Those who knew him well understood. That silence from Patton was far more dangerous than anger. Inside him, a storm of pride, ambition, and heartbreak raged. That night, he wrote in his diary, "I cannot say I am envious, but I do feel sorrow." But sorrow was only part of the truth. Privately, Patton felt he had been passed over for the destiny he had trained for his entire life. He felt the humiliation of seeing his former junior now placed above him. He felt the weight of realizing that political skill, not battlefield brilliance, had made the difference. Yet Patton was not a small man. He was capable of jealousy, yes, but also of duty and honor. And that made what he said next even more powerful. When Patton finally met Eisenhower again after the appointment, he stood tall, saluted sharply, and said, "Congratulations, Ike. No man will support you more than I will." It was not an act. It was a choice, one made by a man who loved victory more than ego. Eisenhower, aware of the emotional complexity under Patton's salute, placed a hand on his friend's shoulder and replied, "George, I need you. I can't win this war without you." Those words mattered. They didn't erase Patton's pain, but they acknowledged it. They recognized Patton's brilliance, his fire, and his irreplaceable role in the coming battles. For all the rank and protocol, this was still a friendship, wounded, reshaped, but intact. Despite his internal struggle, Patton accepted the new hierarchy, not because he was suddenly at peace with it, but because he believed in the mission. He believed in the war. He believed in defeating tyranny more than he believed in protecting his own pride. Soon after, Patton was given command of the Western Task Force for the North African invasion. Eisenhower, now his superior, entrusted him with one of the most important operations of the war. It was both an honor and a test. Patton transformed the demoralized, inexperienced American soldiers into a disciplined force so quickly that even Eisenhower was astonished. Under Patton's fierce leadership, the Americans fought with renewed spirit. His energy on the battlefield, his relentless movement, his aggressive tactics, his refusal to tolerate defeat gave the troops a new identity. The Germans felt it. The Allies saw it. And Eisenhower knew he had placed the right man in command. Patton's victories in North Africa forced his critics into silence. Eisenhower, though superior, openly praised him. And Patton, though still emotionally torn, found himself beginning to respect Eisenhower's role in a new way. He once wrote to his wife, "I carries burdens I would never want. I carry the war. He carries the world." It was the first time Patton acknowledged, even privately, that Eisenhower's job required not just military skill, but a political patience Patton never possessed. Yet beneath this acceptance, the tension remained. Because Patton believed, deeply, painfully, that he could do Eisenhower's job. And Eisenhower believed, quietly, respectfully, that Patton could not. Not because Patton lacked ability, but because he lacked restraint. The world needed Eisenhower's diplomacy just as much as it needed Patton's fury. Their partnership was becoming a beautiful contradiction. Eisenhower needed Patton. Patton resented needing Eisenhower. But together, they made victory possible. Then came Sicily, where the rivalry sharpened. Eisenhower placed the cautious, slow-moving British General Bernard Montgomery in a priority position. Patton was infuriated. He believed Montgomery's strategy was timid, overly conservative, and unworthy of the war's urgent moment. Privately, Patton wrote, "Monty gets the glory. I get the work." He did not write that about Montgomery alone. A part of him believed Eisenhower was allowing Montgomery's ego to overshadow his own brilliance. The old wound reopened. But Patton did what Patton always did. He turned anger into action. In Sicily, he pushed his army forward with blistering speed, capturing Palermo, then racing Montgomery to Messina. He won, of course. He always wanted to win. And when he reached Messina first, he sent Eisenhower a simple message. "Messina taken. The enemy is whipped." But what he did not say aloud was what he felt inside. "I have proven myself again. Does the world see it now?" Eisenhower congratulated him, but also reprimanded him for moving too aggressively. It was the balance they always danced, Eisenhower holding the reins, Patton trying to break them. Still, beneath all the tension and clashing egos, something deeper remained: loyalty. For all his frustrations, all his private complaints, Patton never betrayed Eisenhower. He never turned on him. He never disobeyed with malice. Because Patton loved the mission more than personal glory. And Eisenhower, despite Patton's flaws, never abandoned him. He understood that Patton's fire was both a danger and a gift. He tolerated the danger because the gift, Patton's unmatched battlefield genius, was too powerful to lose. The story of what Patton said when Eisenhower became his boss is not a single moment. It's thousands of moments, some angry, some respectful, some painful, some grateful. It is the story of two men shaped not just by war, but by each other. Yet the true breaking point, and the true test of their relationship, was still ahead, because soon, Patton's temper would ignite a scandal that shook the entire Allied command, and Eisenhower would be forced to choose between friendship and the fate of the war. The victory in Sicily should have been the moment George Patton finally felt recognized, validated, and secure in his place among the most important leaders of the war. But instead, it became the moment his internal battle reached its breaking point. The emotional wound created when Eisenhower became his boss, still unhealed despite months of victories, began to pulse again as the war in the Mediterranean shifted from triumph to controversy. What Patton said next, what he felt, and how he reacted would redefine his relationship with Eisenhower forever. Patton was never good at hiding his emotions. His entire life was a storm, loud, passionate, overflowing with energy that demanded expression. That same fire made him a brilliant battlefield commander, but it also made him vulnerable to the kind of mistakes men with quieter tempers would never make. In Sicily, after pushing his men hard, after beating Montgomery to Messina against all odds, after proving once again that no general could match his speed or aggression, Patton found himself emotionally exhausted. His soldiers admired him but feared him. His officers respected him but worried about the weight he carried alone. He had done everything, everything, to win. And yet, beneath his polished metals and rigid posture, he felt unseen, underappreciated, still living in Eisenhower's shadow. And then came the incident that would nearly destroy him. In early August 1943, Patton visited American medical stations to speak to wounded soldiers. He believed in physical toughness, mental steel, and the idea that a soldier's courage was sacred. But war fatigue was different from cowardice. And Patton, overwhelmed, drained, and blinded by frustration, failed to see that difference clearly. In a tragic lapse of judgment, he slapped two soldiers suffering from battle fatigue. It was a moment of weakness, an explosion of misplaced anger, and something he regretted more than he could admit. Word spread fast. The press caught it. Officers reported it. The military began whispering. And Eisenhower, his boss, his friend, the man who trusted him, was suddenly thrown into a political wildfire that could undermine the entire Allied command. Eisenhower could not ignore what happened. The world was watching. America needed discipline. The Allies needed unity. And Eisenhower, for all his loyalty to Patton, had to act. When Eisenhower summoned him, Patton walked into the room with the heaviness of a man facing judgment not from an enemy, but from someone whose opinion mattered deeply. Eisenhower didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He spoke with the disappointment of a father and the weight of a supreme commander who had no choice but to protect the war effort. "George," Eisenhower said quietly, "what you did was wrong." Patton stood in silence, shoulders rigid, jaw locked. He wasn't angry at Eisenhower. He was angry at himself, at the pressure of command, at the frustration of feeling overlooked, at the emotional chaos that had driven him to an act he could never justify. For once in his life, the unstoppable Patton felt small. "Ike," Patton whispered, "I've failed you." Eisenhower shook his head. "You haven't failed the war, but you've put it at risk. You must apologize." The word apologize hit Patton like a blow to the chest. This was not about pride. It was about identity. Patton had spent his lifetime building an image of absolute strength. Apologizing felt like tearing that image apart with his own hands. He swallowed hard, eyes stiff, trying to maintain his posture. "If this is your order," Patton said slowly, "I will obey." "It is," Eisenhower said, "not because I want to humiliate you, but because it might save your career." That truth hurt worse than the order. Patton realized that the only thing standing between him and removal from command was Eisenhower himself. For all the emotional tension between them, for all the rivalry and unspoken jealousy, Eisenhower still protected him. He didn't abandon him. He didn't let him fall. And Patton felt the weight of that loyalty like a stone on his heart. Patton delivered the apology. Public, painful, humiliating. He stood before his men and admitted he was wrong. Something no one ever expected from the toughest general in the U.S. Army. Reporters swarmed him. Critics sharpened their knives. Allies began to doubt his place in the war. Eisenhower shielded him as much as he could, but the political damage was real. Patton knew it, and he felt it deeply. What Patton said privately afterward revealed his true emotional turmoil. "Ike saved me," Patton confessed to his diary, "but I fear I have lost his confidence forever." He believed, wrongly, that Eisenhower now saw him as a liability, that he would be sidelined, that the dream he had carried since boyhood, that destiny had chosen him to lead the greatest battles of the war, was slipping away, and that he had no one to blame but himself. Yet Eisenhower never saw Patton as expendable. He knew Patton's fire was unmatched, but he also knew the world of politics, press, and diplomacy could eat men like Patton alive. So he waited and watched. and protected him quietly from those who wanted Patton removed permanently. Months passed. Plans evolved. The war shifted toward Europe. And as the Allies prepared for their most important operation, D-Day, Eisenhower faced a decision that would define the war and his relationship with Patton. The world believed Patton was the most dangerous American general in the field, not because he was reckless, but because he was feared by the Germans. Intelligence reports showed that the German high command ranked Patton as the Allies' most formidable commander. They believed he would lead the D-Day assault. They believed he was America's sword. And Eisenhower used that belief brilliantly. He placed Patton in charge of a decoy army, the famous Ghost Army, with fake tanks, fake planes, and fake radio transmissions. The Germans swallowed the deception whole. They kept their strongest forces positioned far from Normandy, convinced Patton would attack at Calais. This deception saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. But for Patton, the assignment was torture. For years, he had dreamed of leading the greatest invasion in history. He had trained for it, lived for it, bled for it. And now, because of his mistakes, he was not leading the charge. He was being used as a weapon of deception, powerful, but sidelined. When Patton received the orders, he walked out of the headquarters tent and stood alone for nearly an hour. Officers passed by, unsure if they should approach him. He looked out across the English countryside with a mix of pain and resignation. And then he said quietly to the officer beside him, "I will not question Ike. He does what must be done. I must do the same." It was not bitterness. It was acceptance. Eisenhower hadn't punished him. He had repurposed him. And Patton realized that this role, though humiliating to his pride, was essential to victory. The day D-Day began, Patton watched from afar, excluded, yet vital. Eisenhower unleashed the invasion without him. And Patton felt something break inside. He wanted to be proud. He wanted to celebrate the moment. But he also wanted to be there, leading the charge, fulfilling the destiny he had built his whole life around. Privately, Patton wrote in his diary that night, "It is God's will that I was not chosen. I must learn patience. Ike carries the weight of the world. I am but one sword." But fate had not forgotten Patton, and neither had Eisenhower. By late summer, the situation in France required a fresh breakthrough, an unstoppable force to shatter German resistance and push toward the heart of Europe. And Eisenhower knew that only one man was capable of such momentum: Patton. He summoned him with the authority of a commander, but the warmth of a friend who had never stopped believing in him. "George," Eisenhower said, "your time has come. I need you to break Germany's back." Patton felt the words like a revival. All the pain, all the shame, all the emotional turmoil of being sidelined seemed to lift off him. He straightened his posture, eyes gleaming with renewed purpose. "You will have your breakthrough," Patton said. "I promise you that." And he delivered, magnificently. With the Third Army under his command, Patton surged across France faster than any army in modern history. Town after town fell. German divisions collapsed under his pressure. The world saw, without question, that Patton was one of the greatest battlefield commanders America had ever produced. But what mattered most was what Patton said afterward. Not to the newspapers, not to his troops, but to Eisenhower. In a private conversation after the liberation of Paris, Patton looked at Eisenhower with a mixture of gratitude, humility, and lingering regret. "Ike," he said softly, "you bore with me. You carried me when I faltered, and you gave me another chance to serve." Eisenhower shook his head. "No, George. You earned it." That moment, simple, quiet, and deeply human, became one of the most emotionally important moments between them. The rivalry, the tension, the jealousy, the misunderstandings, all of it remained part of their story. But so did loyalty, respect, forgiveness, and the recognition that neither man could have won the war without the other. Yet one final test, one final storm, still remained, because the next crisis would push their relationship to its absolute limit. As the final chapters of World War II began to unfold, a strange tension settled over the generals who had once fought side by side in the deserts of North Africa. George S. Patton, the warrior whose voice thundered across continents, now found himself under the direct command of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man he respected, admired, and at times envied. Their relationship had grown complex, woven from threads of brotherhood, rivalry, admiration, and deep philosophical contrast. And as 1944 turned into 1945, these threads tightened, until both men found themselves standing at the edge of history, forced to confront who they were and what they truly believed about leadership, loyalty, and destiny. Patton had grown more restless with each passing week. Europe was burning, nations were desperate for liberation, and the stakes had never been higher. Yet the man who had once been unleashed like a storm across Sicily now found himself being held back by higher command. Eisenhower, the boyish Kansan, who had risen to supreme commander, was no longer just a colleague or a friend. He was the authority, and in Patton's eyes, authority came with responsibility. That responsibility, he felt, was being handled too cautiously, too politically, too gently for the brutal reality of war. He didn't hide that sentiment, not in his diary, not in conversations with his staff, and not even in the heated private discussions he had with Eisenhower behind closed doors. One evening, in the chill of a battered French winter, Patton finally let out the words he had been holding back. He told Eisenhower, with a heavy yet unwavering voice, "If you're going to be my boss, Ike, then you must let me fight the war the way it was meant to be fought." There was no anger in his tone, only conviction. Patton had never feared speaking his truth, especially when he believed lives hung in the balance. To him, Eisenhower's leadership was brilliant, but sometimes too gentle, too diplomatic for a world where hesitation cost lives. Yet beneath his boldness was something deeper, an unspoken respect for the man who'd managed to hold the Allied coalition together when personalities and politics threatened to tear it apart. Eisenhower listened carefully. He always did. His calm presence contrasted sharply with Patton's fire. But that balance was exactly why they had worked so well together for so many years. He knew Patton wasn't simply challenging authority, he was pleading for the chance to fulfill his destiny. Eisenhower responded not with rebuke, but with the steady firmness of a man who carried the weight of nations on his shoulders. He reminded Patton that victory required more than speed and aggression. It required unity among allies, careful political maneuvering, and the ability to see the war not only through the eyes of a soldier, but through the lens of global consequences. The two men stood in silence, the air thick with unspoken truths. In the weeks that followed, Patton pushed deeper into Germany than any other American commander. His Third Army sliced through enemy lines with unmatched force, and with every mile gained, Patton felt his old spirit returning, yet he never forgot that Eisenhower's signature was the reason he had the authority to move it all. In his private journal, Patton wrote something unexpected. He wrote that Eisenhower's greatest strength was not military genius, but the ability to command men who could command armies. It was as close to a confession of admiration as Patton ever allowed himself to express. As spring approached, the world began to see signs that the war was entering its final phase. German defenses were collapsing. Town after town fell to Allied forces. But with victory so near, the pressure on Eisenhower grew heavier than ever. Thousands of decisions were made every hour. Every choice had consequences. And among all the voices advising him, politicians, foreign leaders, generals, Patton's voice remained the loudest and most relentless. But despite their differences, Eisenhower never removed Patton from command, never silenced him, and never dismissed his value. He instead gave Patton exactly what he needed, the space to be the warrior he was born to be. As April came, Patton's armies liberated towns still bearing scars of cruelty. He saw civilians rising from terror, soldiers embracing survival, and hope slowly gathering in the ruins. It was during this time that Patton reflected more deeply on Eisenhower's leadership. He acknowledged privately that perhaps the war had needed both of them, his fire and Eisenhower's calm, to reach this point. In his moments of honesty, he even admitted that Eisenhower's rise to command had given the Allies something Patton alone could never provide: stability. Then came the day the war finally ended in Europe. Bells rang. Soldiers wept. Civilians hugged strangers in the streets. Patton stood among his men, feeling both pride and sorrow, pride for victory, sorrow for those who never lived to see it. That night, he wrote one last statement in his diary about Eisenhower. "He has been my boss, and he has been a good one." The words were simple, but from Patton, they were monumental. They represented years of conflict, respect, frustration, and unbreakable brotherhood distilled into a sentence. In the days that followed, Eisenhower invited Patton to join him for a private conversation. This time there was no tension, no disagreement, only the mutual acknowledgement of a journey that had changed both their lives. Patton spoke candidly. He told Eisenhower, "You led the greatest force the world has ever known, and you held it together with a steady hand. I fought the battles, but you won the war." For a man of Patton's pride, those words carried enormous weight. It wasn't surrender, it was recognition. Eisenhower, moved by Patton's sincerity, responded with equal humility. He admitted that Patton had been the fire he needed, the force that kept pushing, kept challenging, kept reminding him of the raw reality of war. Eisenhower even confessed that without Patton's relentless drive, many victories may have taken longer or even slipped away. The two men talked for hours, not as commander and subordinate, but as comrades whose destinies had been intertwined since the day they first met at West Point. Their relationship in the post-war months took on a new dimension. Patton, though restless in peacetime, found solace in knowing that his battles had not been fought alone. And Eisenhower, preparing to transition into a new chapter of life, never forgot the man who had pushed him, challenged him, and stood beside him in the darkest days. They both understood something profound. Leadership wasn't about titles or ranks. It was about the willingness to carry burdens together. Patton later wrote that Eisenhower had been a soldier's commander, someone who understood men as much as he understood maps. And although he often wished Eisenhower had let him fight with fewer restrictions, he ultimately recognized that a war of this magnitude needed a guiding force who could balance military action with political necessity. Patton finally realized that Eisenhower had not been trying to restrain him, he had been trying to protect the fragile structure of an alliance that spanned nations and ideologies. As the world began to rebuild, the friendship between Eisenhower and Patton became a quiet testament to the complexity of leadership. They had fought different wars within the same war, one external, one internal. Patton's war was against the enemy. Eisenhower's war was against time, politics, and the enormous pressure of keeping nations united. Yet in the end, both men had fought for the same dream, a world free from tyranny. The story of what Patton said when Eisenhower became his boss is more than military history. It is a story of two men shaped by destiny, bound by duty, and strengthened by the very differences that once threatened to divide them. Patton's fiery words, spoken in frustration or passion, were always rooted in his desire to win, never in disrespect. And Eisenhower's calm responses, even in the face of Patton's intensity, came from a deep understanding of the weight they both carried. Their journey teaches us something powerful, that greatness is rarely simple, that leadership is not about dominating but about balancing strengths, that even the strongest warriors need someone who sees the bigger picture, and that behind every victory, there are relationships, messy, emotional, human relationships, that shape the outcome far more than weapons or strategies ever could. To this day, historians revisit their conversations, their disagreements, and their shared triumphs. But the truth lies in the quiet words Patton left behind. He said that Eisenhower did not command with fear, but with trust. And in the end, Patton believed that was the mark of a true leader. Eisenhower, reflecting years later, said that Patton was the bravest man I ever knew. These two statements, simple yet profound, capture the essence of one of the most complex partnerships in American history. Their story ends not with conflict, but with understanding. Not with rivalry, but with deep, enduring respect. Patton and Eisenhower, two giants standing on opposite ends of the same battlefield, united by duty, shaped by war, and remembered forever as leaders whose differences created the very harmony that helped win the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. In the end, what Patton said when Eisenhower became his boss was not just a complaint or a challenge. It was a declaration of who he was, a fighter who believed in decisive action, a soldier who demanded excellence, and a commander who understood the cost of hesitation. But beneath all of that, he also said something else, through his actions, through his loyalty, and through the respect he ultimately gave Eisenhower. He said that leadership, at its best, is shared. that no general wins alone, and that even the fiercest warrior needs someone he can follow.